Welcome to Great Adventure Designers. I think we're on episode 4 now, after some delay. And this time we are going to the original Dungeon Master, Gary Gygax. Now, I think it's uncontroversial to say that Gary Gygax is a big figure in Dungeons and Dragons history, and certainly in all aspects of it. But it's not necessarily underappreciated, but it's possibly important to separate the rules designer, Gary Gygax, from the adventure designer, Gary Gygax. And I think he's vital in both areas. I think there would be no game as we know it without Gary Gygax. Dave Arnott on his own, even if he had somehow been convinced to write a set of rules up, and neither had the business vision, as crazy as Gary's business vision was, nor did he, I think, have that kind of systematizing impulse that Gary had. But the adventure designer Gary Gygax is possibly, in modern terms, when we're trying to think about what to reclaim in terms of what makes a good game, there's a mix between, always a virtuous loop between the two, but the adventure design is the thing that sticks out as essentially so iconic and so trailblazing in some ways. And it is, there's a strong argument to be made for the fact that he's the best designer ever of D&D adventures. I've separately argued I think Bruce Cordell, who I've also talked about in this series, might be better due to particular facets of the madness that is Bruce Cordell's adventure design. But Gary was incredibly prolific, incredibly trailblazing, and incredibly good. And the way I've tried to talk about the designers in this series is to talk about 3 axes, I guess. Not necessarily systematically talk through them, but roughly depth, or quality, how good and how deep and how intelligent are the things these guys design, and breadth, what's the range of things they design. If you only ever design, guy's got 40 modules, but they're all fairly similar, very good, but fairly similar dungeon adventures. You say that's really good, but is it as good as this person who has done different things? And third, in the positive sense, innovation or originality. How far has this designer opened up new territory? And Gary scores very highly on all 3. Innovation, he's cheating because he's the first seriously published author. There's some before stuff is published by him. There's one full module, Pass of the Vampire Queen. I have reviewed it on the channel. And there's magazine adventures. So, I've got a cold, by the way. You're going to have to put up with that, aren't you? You get the idea, anyway, that he is so early that everything he does is new. But he is good, and he does a broad range. He doesn't just innovate one thing, but many things. And so let's talk. I'm not going to talk about his rules design. I think the basic architecture of classic D&D and first edition AD&D is obviously great. I think there is a lot to be said about what you see in second edition in trying to work out what's going on in first edition. You can also look at someone like Anthony Huso, who's doing a parallel work to second edition in terms of trying to say, well, what are the weird nooks and crannies of the system? Why does it matter? What is the real idea here? But yeah, anyway, the one thing I will say from his rules is that we do get for many people who have been their first adventure who bought AD&D books, you get the sample dungeon. You get a layer of sample dungeon, which is the monastery cellars and secret crypts. And the idea is that this place is you get only a few rooms detailed, but the idea is that you're given a map and you're told to develop it from there. It's a bit like some of the B series stuff, but in an AD&D book. And you get pretty classic Gygaxian stuff in these 3 rooms. You get his fairly memorable style of keying and writing stuff in its own way. The limed over skeleton of the abbot is in this pool of water, but it appears to be merely a somewhat unusual mineral formation. Clutched in the bony fingers is the special key which will allow the secret door at location 28 to open to the treasury room 29 rather than to the steps which lead down to the cavern steps down at 30. You can see just in that tiny example this connection between different parts of the dungeon, the need to investigate and explore both that pool but also work out that the door might link, there might be multiple doors going out of one entrance. That's an aside, really a curio. I should say I'm also not going to be looking at Gary's post-TSR design, somewhat dangerous journeys, but more importantly legendary adventures and castles and crusades, sword and sorcery, which I think are actually quite important. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that shows he still had something, but they're not his key period and they don't really define him. I will, I think, hopefully make another video about that sometime. But what did Gary innovate then? What was his innovation? What was his breadth? What was his quality? We see that hint of, here's a guy just making up the dungeon adventure, you know, helping make up the first mega dungeons. He makes up Castle Greyhawk, and he has this immediate feel that these dungeons are sprawling environments which require connecting the dots. And you do get amongst his modules, I mean, most of them, basically all of these, I have most of his TSR era modules. I don't have a couple of them. I don't have his Gamma World one, and I don't have WG5 and 6 and X1 and 2 in print. But I've got the rest. And virtually all of them have a dungeon. You've got the Caves of Chaos. You have 3 dungeons, particularly the cellars in G1 and G3. You have the Shrine of the Kuratoa, which is dungeon-like. You have the Fane of Lolth in D3. You have the Moat House in T1. You have, obviously, the Temple of Elemental Evil, the whole multi-level dungeon in T2 to 3. You have the Tomb of Horrors. It's pretty arguable the spaceship in Expedition to the Barrier Peaks S3 is itself a dungeon, and mostly follows dungeon-like rules. And the Lost Caverns of Sojkanth are 2 layers of fairly detailed, complex dungeon, and then the cellars in WG4 Forgotten Temple. The dungeon is the main thing Gary works on. There are fewer wilderness sections. He experiments with it in S4 and WG4, and I think somewhat successfully. Dungeons run through to the end of what he does too. You look at his level 1 adventure for Legendary Adventures. I know I'm breaking my own rule here, but he's still designing maps that look like a layer of the Lost Caverns of Sojkanth. But the dungeon, even when he experiments with, oh well, there's a really detailed village here, T1, or there's a wilderness crawl, D1 to 3, or there's a kind of open wilderness area, I S4 and WG4. Even where that is, the idea that you go into an interior space and you clear through things and you find stuff, and you defeat enemies and you negotiate and you deal with traps, that's the core feature of his design philosophy. I've talked elsewhere about how David Cook, has a particular strength, an underappreciated strength of actually being able to open out into a more wilderness-like environment, and that's a strength of his where the particular dungeon play cycle is exploded out and morphed into a slightly different thing. Gary focuses nearly entirely, in terms of what he's really interested in, on the dungeon. I think in possibly in S4, it's even, I think it's S4 rather than WG4. It's even made clear. Oh yeah, the original version of this didn't even have a wilderness element. I've added this later. And so the dungeon adventure is, as we understand it now, really just a Gary thing. You know, there are other early dungeons, but so many of the things we understand to be integral to, or classic, let's say classic about the dungeon experience, are things you mostly learn from these modules. I'd say there are large elements of the 4 modules which I don't own, which also touch on the dungeon, less so perhaps. X1 and X2 are both sort of weird dual boxes, as is WG6, and WG5 is intentionally bonkers and does have dungeon elements. But within those dungeons there's a wide variety of stuff, types, and I think it's worth highlighting what some of those are. It's worth saying as well, you are talking about the guy who first offers the wilderness crawl. I'm saying Zeb Cook was very good at it, but there's no crawl, the kind of semi-linear but half also optioned crawl like in D1 to 3, or the open map wander around with potential dungeon objectives of these two modules. Those are things that we see in print books of Gary. So to be fair to him, he's also important for that. But I think it's the modulation and the creation of different environments for the dungeon and the different objectives within a dungeon are something which is also significantly pioneered and in breadth by Gygax. B2 may be the least so, but there you have one version of the Monster Zoo. Also the negotiating, interacting with different factions, kind of Red Nails Zoo. You get the archetypal Gygax Monster Zoo is S4, Lost Caverns of Sojkanth. You have the hyper tactical element of WG4, or depending on an escape plan, D2. WG4 also has weird, terrifying caverns, which you definitely get hints of in the G series. G1 to 3 though are more archetypal base assaults. Like, the idea is you're ending up going to this giant's headquarters, this giant king's place. First the hill giant, then the frost giant, then the fire giant, and you're trying to take them out. And you've got to sneak in, or maybe you've got to assault, or maybe you've got to find any allies you can there. B2 could be a base assault, but it's not archetypally so. G1 to 3 is. D1 is sort of a monster zoo. D3 on the other hand is this whole thing where there's a bit of wilderness crawl, then there is sort of a city adventure, and a sort of wilderness element. It's a very good module. I think I've argued it might be his best, but it's weird how these all fit together with this wider sense of the dungeon in a strange environment, and the idea this multi-layered adding together the different things that he had designed or was good at to become one challenge. How do you get into the Drow city? How do you find your way around the city? How do you get to the objective point? How do you then deal with this strange place that eventually ends up with Lolth as an opponent? T1, that's, if you like, though it has tiny bits of Monster Zoo elements. Gygaxian naturalism often leads to the Monster Zoo, where monsters are weirdly close to each other, but have these internally organic reasons for being there. It makes sense, but you have to accept the animal behaviour of the world of Gygax. But T1 and the Moat House is maybe the closest to... T1, by the way, is also where the archetypal detailed settlement comes from. So that's the thing he invents in adventure design. But the dungeon, the Moat House, is maybe the archetypal classic dungeon. Multi-layered, semi-ruined. There's a bad guy somewhere near the end, but there's also weird side alleys and other gribblies around. S1 is the archetypal trap and challenge dungeon. I recently did a review of this. It is... obviously, probably people watching this know this. It's a misunderstood module. It is not a module to screw over players or to not be fun. It's not meant to be a negative play experience. It's meant to be a final challenge for experienced players who know that what is in their brain and what is in their equipment, as it were, as well as the choices of spells they make and the whatever, all those combine into the final challenge they make, where all their decisions come together to see if they can solve this ultimate puzzle dungeon. S4, as I say, is a Monster Zoo. WG4 I've done, and S3 is a dungeon, but it's one that it's a spaceship. You go into this weird thing that's blown up a mountain, and it turns out there's all kinds of weird animals over it. There's robots. There's some sentience that you can negotiate with. There's all kinds of creatures to interact with and technology to get that you have to work out. There's a whole mini game functionally where in the illustrations book, which has colour in it remarkably, there are pictures. These are guns, by the way. How do you know that? Well, your players have to find it out. It is an iteration of the dungeon, but saying you don't need it to be fantasy for it to be in terms of high fantasy for it to be a dungeon. The dungeon experience has to do with the play loop of the dungeon experience. So you have all this breadth of creation, as I say, in more ancillary terms, but vitally, no one had done it before really in the same way. The first big settlement like that, the first wilderness treks and open map explorations, and then there's also this wide variety of iterations of the dungeon, the different things that dungeons do. There's also something he offers because, and this is a personality thing that is hard for other writers probably since to replicate. Very few of them probably do, or at least do it successfully, but which is that there is also an authorial voice which helps you learn how to run adventures. So an area of innovation is DM advice that's actually useful in the context of the adventure. The most obvious of these, but it happens everywhere, I see if I pick out another couple, is B2. B2 was meant to be an introductory module. It came with the second version of Basic, with Moldvay Basic, and it has, so you flick in, and it has an introduction, then it has notes for the Dungeon Master, which says this is basically what this is for, and it kind of describes roughly what happens in the not in an individual mechanical game of D&D, but what D&D is. And then a couple of pages later it has how to be an effective Dungeon Master. As Dungeon Master, the beginner is faced with a difficult problem. The DM is the most important person in the D&D game. Unlike most board games, D&D relies on information both from the players and the DM. In board games, the way the game is played is obvious, etc. As a judge, moderator, or referee, the DM must constantly deal with the players. Just as the referee of a sporting event, the DM must be fair. He or she cannot be out to get the players, nor should she be on their side all the time. The DM must be neutral. If a party has played well and succeeded, the DM should not punish them by sending more and more monsters at them or thwart their plans. Of course, you get some of this stuff as well here, and it bleeds into rules design, I admit. But I think there's an important point here that there's an understanding that when you're trying to train people to play D&D, you do it via a module. The advice is not in the proto-cyclopedia, but here by the guy who invented the game. And it's saying, look, this is what D&D is for. You get the same, some fairly obvious ones. You get some similar things. Notes to the Dungeon Master at the start of S1, which is, negotiation of the two will require a long time to be prepared to spend several sessions with this module. This is not if your group is a hack and slide gathering, your group will be unhappy because this is a thinking person's module. The advice is there, by the way, for everyone who has ever complained about it since. S4 starts with is it here? Talking about what your players might need. I guess it starts there at the start with some sort of commentary on what players should be able to expect and what skills you need to have. Not all of them have the same level of advice, but I mean they all have something. They all have half a page of notes for the Dungeon Master. You'll have to make up certain details of areas. There'll be actions which are not allowed for here, and you'll have to judge whether or not you will permit them. Finally, you can amend and alter monsters and treasures as you see fit, hopefully within the parameters of the module and with an eye towards the whole, but to suit your particular players. Morale should not be a factor in most giant actions. If time permits, the giants will organise traps. If you plan to continue this module by using the other modules in the series, be sent to keep the track of certain important giants and their allies. You've got someone who's saying, not you must run things in this way. There's a way he's teaching you to approach the modules he's writing. Not to approach things in this way, you have to do it like this, and then you get there. Or, this is the way to avoid this. I've written stuff, but the way to avoid that is to do this. A very bad habit you get with 5th edition modules, but also not even late 1st edition and 2nd edition modules, is this crazy thing where the designer says, if the players do this, stop them. Or, if your players wouldn't enjoy this, just destroy the module. And of course there's a truth that if your players really won't enjoy something, change it. But the point is, they've written something. It's quite in this glossy book. It's quite expensive. You've spent money to get these words, and then it turns out the author doesn't really care. They don't believe in the stuff they've written. Gary does believe in the stuff he's written, but he gives you genuine advice about how it will work on the fly. Well, you might need to add this, or you'll need to work out how this fits together with the need to make this a coherent campaign. There is a way in which, again, almost irreplaceably, irreplicably, which way round is it? There is an author who can really say to you, look, this is how you run the game. And for all his obvious flaws and for all his destructive capability in some ways, you read these modules and you get an insight into someone who really likes playing D&D and wants to help you play D&D well. And some people would say you see that changing a bit as the business mindset gets on and the idea of all these things have to happen. But really, I mean, maybe you get that towards Unearthed Arcana. One thing I said a module I do not own, technically by Gary Gygax, is Q1, Queen of the Demon Web Pits. I forgot to say this, but this is an example of a bad habit, for what it's worth. He didn't actually write this module. He had some ideas for it, and his mate Dave Sutherland wrote it. Anyway, I don't have that module here either, and I haven't even mentioned it. I'd forgotten it existed. I remembered it before the video started rolling. Just remembered it again. So you have this breadth of innovation for the first time, this depth of iterations of the dungeon. You've got this important voice of explaining what the game is, what an adventure is, what your job is running it. Because of course, there's not a game out in the ether that exists because this book exists. There's a game that exists because you and your friends are at the table running it, and so you each have a role in that cooperative creation of a world and a story. So innovation, I think, is fairly obvious. Breadth, I hope, is fairly obvious. It's also, this is one place I should say where the later post-TSR stuff also highlights how much he could get up to. And I'm thinking maybe most of Necropolis, somewhat of Hall of Many Pains. He was endlessly creative with new ideas for stuff to do and places to go, and what would happen. This is the whole thing you go through here. What would happen if you're attacking giant bases and it was a war? What would happen if I've invented the Underdark. Is this crazy half Narnia, half Lovecraft, all nightmare place? And yes, and it's got all these crazy new monsters and stuff. That's part of the innovation, is that he's just constantly making up monsters, and to a lesser degree artifactual magic items. Less so that, but occasionally that. Particularly S4 is a good example of that. He just adds new systems. What would happen if there were special rules for magic runes and magic circles? Never mentioned anywhere else, really. What would happen if a dungeon was a trick dungeon? There was an in-world story for it being a trick dungeon, so to get the real stuff you had to work out what the real dungeon was. What would happen if it's a spaceship? What would happen if you had to fight a battle to get into it? Like all these iterations on the dungeon, and all these little tweaks. So all these things are going on. Breadth and originality are obvious. Depth, though, in terms of quality, that's maybe the last big category. It is the last of my three categories to talk about. And there's a thing with Gary that there's a sense, ironically, that both you're talking about the most accomplished, best designer, deepest, most quality, most good examples of things to do if you're writing a module, easiest to read in some respects, and undeniably these are not bad to use on the fly. Like I remember very pleasurably running D2, and with the caveats of using the exact physical media, knowing I could flick between stuff, and that if I'd given it one read, I would have a good idea, and if I'd given it two reads, that I would probably be able to run it well. You could say that, and you can also say that there is a way in which Gary perhaps never quite reached his potential, and this is, again, the post-TSR stuff does come into this a bit. It's interesting to look at stuff like Necropolis and Hall of Many Pains and see, maybe with a slightly different mindset sometimes, but nonetheless the sheer creativity available. But T1 to 4 ends up being, it's his adventure. This is a Gary Gygax adventure, but it ends up finished by Frank Menser. Q1 I've mentioned, actually mostly written by Dave Sutherland, and his obvious great project that should have been the capstone, his campaign dungeon, i.e. Castle Greyhawk itself, he does not write an official version of. There's a weird parody version of WG. Is it WG7 or 8? I think it's 7. 8 is Fate of Istus, maybe. There's then a later second edition, Ruins of Greyhawk, which is a bit more serious but still isn't very much detail. And then, not long before Gary died, he started publishing another third edition era version of Castle Greyhawk with Jeff Talanian. So there is still the question of cooperation and whose bit is whose, but whatever. He'd collaborated in the original, of course, with Rob Kuntz, and then he dies, and you only get the upper works and Igsburg, which is basically the city of Greyhawk. So did we see the things that he was in some way at home most famous for? In his home game, he's most famous, amongst other stuff, but really for the Temple and for Castle Greyhawk. And that's not the stuff we got as punters. And I think there's probably just something there about, especially as the business got bigger, the obvious thing is that, and as Gary, his own life developed in particular directions, time was harder to come by, focus was harder to come by, and so, and you get this pattern of him not really finishing his work or putting his name to work that wasn't really wholly his later on in his TSR career. Oriental Adventures, similarly, mostly by Zeb Cook. But the idea that he just didn't have the time and focus to finish these big projects that really required 3 months at the grindstone. He was running a business and he had the rest of his life going on. But when there was a smaller format to play with, I should say, by the way, of those, T1 to 4 is a really good module. It's not perfect, it's flawed, but it is really good. Of the completed modules and the modules that are just by him, nearly universally, you could maybe argue WG8 is good at doing a high level. I mentioned actually in terms of importance of innovation in a second. I'll go up because it touches all those things. He touches on some of the high level stuff. He never quite hits the ultimate mark there, but he does do a bit of that. But everything he does, with maybe the exception of, is WG8 fun or is it great? X1 and X2 are creative, but they're gimmicks. So, but they're not. They're all meant to be. They're pocket dimensions in Castle Greyhawk. They weren't meant to be a whole thing, and so I give a free pass there. They're worthwhile. But the completed ordinary modules, notably X1 and X2, are literally extra excursion. But these other ones that are sole authored are basically all great. They are, and in terms of my collection, that is. I have 9 of them. There are another 3 or something. It depends how they're printed too. G1, 2 and 3 could all be printed separately. But yeah, there are 9 of them plus another 3 that I don't own. And these are all great. B2, though it's thin in some areas, the actual Caves of Chaos and the keep themselves are both iconic locations. He writes often evocative, though not always, but simple, easy, approachable prose about the rooms. 17, Guard Chamber. 6 goblin guards with javelins and clubs, Dex 11, AC 6, HD 1-1, HP 3 each, are alertly watching both passages here for intruders of any sort, including hobgoblins from the south. They each have D4 times 10 copper and D4 silver pieces. The chamber has a barrel with 72 small javelins, a small table, 2 benches, and a keg of water. This is a guard chamber. You don't need to have lots of details. You know these goblins are doing this job. You have their stat line, simplified stat line. You have their behaviour, and the behaviour has the adverb alertly. It has a caveat, or at least a clarity. Yes, they're definitely watching for hobgoblins from the south. They're not just watching north, they're definitely watching for a place their current enemies come from. And it gives you loot. It's a boring room in the sense it's a simple room with no great tricks. But 2 things. 1, it doesn't take too long to describe. And 2, it's described very clearly. Let's just find another Caves of Chaos one. this is the general description for Bugbear Lair. The group of bugbears is not numerous, but it lacks in numbers it makes up for in strength and cunning. There are signs beside the entrance cave in kobold, orcish, goblin, etc. Each says, safety, security, and repose for all humility who enter. Welcome. Come and report to the first guard on the left for a hot meal and bed assignment. So there's a joke as well. It's a gag. Obviously they kill them and stuff. So yeah, you've got this quite easy to approach dynamic situation, and the keep as well, it has all the detail you need for it. G1 to 3 just has both this very clear base assault scenario with iconic environments, you know, this almost comfortable Saxon longhouse for the hill giants, this frosty rift, which I guess we have there of the frost giants, and then a castle, a mighty castle for the fire giant king. But you also get weird stuff which starts hinting at sort of things man is not meant to know, forgotten gods, abandoned excavations in tunnels. There's always conceptual density is quite strong in Gygax. Not in multiple senses. There's an extra location. Often there's a random imprisoned stone giant you can become friends with. Oh, there's an altar to Tharisden that's just here. There's bits, though there's not the Kunsian depth of something in level 1 connected to something in level 7, though there are examples of stuff being connected across levels in some detail, there is instead a habit of putting something else on top. Not just extra elements, but extra things that deepen the whole place, that make the whole place make more sense. They both have a natural, organic, a Gygaxian naturalism, I've called it, or other people have called it, I didn't come up with that. But also a variety, and an organic variety that makes sense. They were excavating, they found this strange ancient abandoned altar, they're now hiding from it. And D1 to 3, I guess I mostly think of, some people say S4 is similar to this, or S3, certainly S3 is, but the sheer creativity of creating this whole underworld place with new monsters, with the wide variety of environments, and with different mission types within them. Particularly D2 and D3 have very different average denouements, I think. The environmentals of the Drow city are basically pretty much as good as Gary ever got. I do think, by the way, I talked about this in the reviews on them, I do think there's a lot to be said for the wilderness elements of this, even if it wasn't his biggest thing. But the Vault of the Drow itself, if we can get to, I think there was like is there a general description, or is it just at the start? The general feel of this city as you get there, some of it is simple, you know, you're just hearing about troglodyte tunnels with the exact numbers of females and eggs and group leaders and so on, but then you have this description of the Tower of Watch. You've got this one-page dungeon, then you have the female fighters society, you've got all these kinds of merchant clans and the different symbols you might be able to get from them, which will help you get elsewhere. And then the city itself, Orelhe Kinlu, the stronghold of the dark elven folk, is countless centuries old. It is surrounded by walls of black stone. The alien and strangely disturbing buildings of Orelhe Kinlu are crowded together in a welter which confuse any not born and bred to the place. Its crooked, narrow streets and alleys are dimly illuminated by signs, scribed in phosphorescent chemicals and occasional lichen growths, or fire beetle cages. Not even the drow are certain what horrors lurk in the sewers beneath, but the rooftops are home to many sorts of large, huge and giant spiders. The main ways of this ancient and depraved city are thronged with as unlikely a mixture of creatures as can be imagined. So you get the feel, don't you? It's very evocative, and it's also, at the time it was new, but it's something I don't look and think, the Menzo Barons and books for 2nd and 4th, or Out of the Abyss for 5th were better than that. There's lots of good things to say about some of those actually, but that there's something there where he is, the well is freshly tapped, and all of this is coming out without a filter, without a wider D&D tradition it has to live in. It is in the tradition, but it's creating its own new path within it, and I think that's very strong in the Underdark modules. Set aside these, I mean, Hommlet is just by Gary, to be fair, and there I think you just didn't have the example of, whereas B2 is, though it can be very challenging, is this kind of fairly open, dynamic, funny environment, all these little humanoid tribes. The Moat House, the first likely encounter is giant frogs who kill your entire party. There is inherent in the module an idea that this is a big boy module. This is something where yes, maybe the good DM knows to put in some other stuff first, but ultimately a low leveler party is going to end up trying to deal with this quite tough, multi-leveled classic dungeon, and Lareth the Beautiful is rightly considered a great boss, and a great dungeon boss. There is the sense that though it's not necessarily, I mean, it is not of all his dungeons my favourite, or the one that I think most articulates his sheer creativity, but the way in which it fits together. One thing, his maps are basically just never boring, even when they're not super complex, and the Moat House is a good example. You technically have different approaches there, but there's one obvious one. You have a couple of ways into and through stuff, and mostly the upper level is not heavily guarded, but there are a bunch of dangers in it, so it becomes that sort of the ruin exploration. There are guards though. As you go down, you have this very mildly looped. It doesn't rely heavily on looping. It has basically has this one major loop coming through here. You come down here. This, however, is an open area, so you don't have a loop. You have an open area with different dangers. And he always gives order of battle information about who's coming, who responds to what. That's one thing you sometimes pick up. There's a certain point though where modules increasingly do not tell you what's likely to happen if someone's nearby. You're just told, okay, these rooms are like this, and you're not told what would happen if the goblins heard what you did in the treasure room. Gary, as a wargamer who, certainly at first as well, did use miniatures, less so later on, that's always on his mind. And so the keys and the environment set up, such as, for instance, this little base, represent that. The loop, there is one loop, but it's not a vital loop. There is technically another massive loop here, or set of loops with these tunnels. They're not very fun to go to. They're intentionally not very fun. The depth and breadth of traps and grief tricks in S1 is something to behold. That's not a criticism, it's not a suggestion, it's a nasty module. To repeat myself, it's meant to be the final puzzle, and it is one where players are allowed to, generally speaking, think about stuff before they act. Most of the time there is space to think and decide, and to try to make good judgments, and to use your resources, because this one thing is, Gary is a resource DM. He's a DM who wants you to have to spend resources. So I saw someone actually making a point about a stream they'd seen of the 5th edition version of Tomb in Yawning Portal, and the fact that the players created non-investigative, heavily fighty characters, and for the magic items just brought buffs. Where you think, no, get your unseen servants, get your familiars, get your summonses, get your detect spells, get your pass walls. These are the spells you bring in, these are the magic items you bring in, these are the allies you bring in, to test out stuff and give yourselves opportunities not to have to die, to find out whether or not something is lethal. And that's something which, again, probably no one has done it better than Gary, and no one has ever done it as explicitly. But you maybe S2 White Plume Mountain and C1 Hidden Shrine of Tamura-chan by other authors do that, but S1 is the gold standard. And I've already adverted to it, but S3 is particularly good This is the thing I want to praise most. Go and look at my reviews of all these modules if you want a more detailed view on any of them. But Gary understands that players trying to work out stuff is fun. It is fun for the players to work out how things work. The idea that you have to test magic items, for instance, rather than just you attune to them and you know what they do. And there's a limited value for that, I think, by the way, sometimes to be like, okay, you've used it, you know, this is a +2 sword. I think that's fine. That is assumed in first edition too. But generally speaking, the idea that you have to work to find out what lots of things do. This is the best example. They find an item. It has particular things you screw, like dials. It has an ammo format. That's a rifle there. That's a pistol, I think. And they have to work out how to use, because they're lasers. They're using a screen. They're using mirrors. I think is that like a sickness or sleep ray, possibly. What that one and that one's like, or maybe that's a pain thing. There's kind of ones that look more like guns. Maybe that one, but I think that one is the one that is least like a gun. And there's ones that are kind of like guns, but you have to put it on your arm, and then you have to work out how to control it. And then, what are even of these things? That is not a gun, despite looking like a gun. Your players are going to have to experiment, and I think the idea that what a major part of the core loop of the dungeon, and this is not really true. This is not true in the Wilderness Adventure. The core loop of the Wilderness Adventure does include resource expenditure, but not the same resources as in the dungeon, and it includes the need to search and to interact and find ways of finding whatever the objectives are within the wilderness. And so there is a different set of skills are required. The key dungeon loop, which is Gary's biggest interest, and I'd say when he does do a classic, you know, when he does do wilderness stuff, his first big wilderness stuff in the D series is much less like that and doesn't really require those skills as much. S4 and WG4 slightly more, to be fair. But the key dungeon loop includes this. The information you're trying to gain is about how the things in a fairly close environment connect, and you're trying to get stuff specifically from that. You might get loot in the wilderness, but really the dungeon is meant to be a high density loot location, and the loot can be solutions to other stuff in the dungeon, fairly close by in a short time period in game. And I think that's the thing that S3 shows one of the key challenges, which is that you have to work out how it works, and you have to learn about the world as part of that. So yeah, I think that's in general what I'd say. I was going to comment. The other thing I was going to comment is on. So yeah, he has great originality, great breadth, and great depth, where he just does stuff really well. His writing is clear. The things he does are really good articulations of the challenges needed in the dungeon, in dungeon design, and uses of maps, and iconic uses of monsters and things like that. I was going to mention to finish, maybe I should have mentioned it earlier, but if we're going to talk about another potential limitation, or at least it's something to comment on, it's how he deals with high-level adventures. And he had high-level adventures, to be fair, and you think about, you realise that some of his players played modules higher level but in smaller groups. There's different ways it seems to have worked over time. Gary did not put out a singular "this is the best high level adventure ever." That is not the thing he accomplished. You do have a low level adventure in this and in T1 to 4. You have some very classic, iconic mid-level stuff. The giant stuff, G1 to 3, is mostly, I would argue, a mid-level. Not wholly, it's complicated, but most of it is actually pretty mid-level. T1 to 4 is actually low to mid. You have, S3 and S4, technically at levels 8 to 12 and 6 to 10, they're very much mid, high mid, and WG4 5 to 10 similarly. He does touch by the time you get to particularly D3. D3 is the beginnings of a high level module, and you see the different things the different problems he gives, and the way he solves over the whole range of levels. You can see he does come up with solutions to the problem of players becoming better, and he does it better than some whole editions since. Particularly, he has two key solutions to players getting better at stuff, which is one, their enemies getting better, and two, their enemies getting more numerous. And by enemies, I include traps as well. S1 is the best example of the traps as an enemy becoming better. They become more complex and requiring more search to get the information out of them. But he never really hit the point of saying, outside of just beginning to touch on D3, his other great high-level adventure, Q1, he didn't even write. That would have been it's a planar adventure, that's where he is going. Hall of Many Pains is a clue of where he was interested in going with it, at least in part. But Q1 isn't even by him, and isn't a particularly strong module. But he never quite hit the heights of going, here's the definitive high-level module. I think that is left more for, and I think these are the two that are best at it that I have read, with Bruce Cordell and Anthony Husso. Those are people to go to really see what AD&D looks like at a high level. But everything else, pretty much, without perhaps hitting the very high notes of his career, but in terms of just a sheer body of work, hitting all the main categories importantly, and giving clues even to the areas he wasn't himself able to surmount Everest, you know, the mega dungeon, super mega dungeon, the planar high level adventure, things like that. Even there, he showed the way. He gave you a hint of what you could do. Every mega dungeon in that sense, after all, is a copy of really either Temple or Castle Greyhawk as we imagine it to be. All that makes Gary at least the second best designer ever, let's say, for adventures in D&D, and perhaps the best. It depends what you rate most important. I think most people probably would, who have read widely, would say he's the best. What do you think? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and maybe to talk about stuff that I've neglected to talk about, and go through some of the other adventures in more detail. Tell me if you have read any of his Dangerous Journeys, Sword and Sorcery, Castles and Crusades, Legendary Adventures, Afterlife. I'd love to hear from you on that as well. All of that in the comments. Till next time.